From an athletic standpoint, when a coach provides that feedback, what mindset should a player try to be in to receive and process this information? And then should a athlete maybe repeat back some of what they hear the coach say so there's no miscommunication out there?
Oh, I think that's massive. So, yeah, the process of feedback is a little bit of a ping pong where uh, the coach is observing what's going on from you. So they have to make an interpretation and a judgment based on what's going on. Then they're going to deliver that information to the athlete. That athlete, not only do they have to deliver that information, they have to deliver the information in a way that matches what it was that they just saw. And then the athlete needs to receive that information and interpret it in a way that is consistent with the way the coach just described it. Then they have to communicate back to the coach in a way that's consistent with how they interpreted what the coach interpreted. So you could imagine that there's a lot of opportunities for misunderstanding in that feedback process.
Right.
And we don't always have the time at a practice to be able to have a long sit down with, did you understand that feedback and such? However, there is a time and place for the athlete to say, yes, I understand, or coach, can you explain that? Or what I think I'm hearing you say is I need to do X, Y, and Z. I think that is a very important exercise to get him accustomed to. The problem is when we have time constraints. So if you can't necessarily do that in the moment, taking deliberate time after the practice or before the practice or during a break to circle around and assess, did I get this feedback right? Am I correct that this is what you actually wanted to say? The overall stance, hopefully that athletes and other human beings take when receiving feedback is that you're open, because feedback is a gift. Right? There is no other way for us to become aware of our blind spots and areas of growth, if not for feedback. And so if we want to get better, if we want to grow, if we want to develop into our fuller potential, receiving feedback is the nourishment. Feedback is the nourishment that helps us grow. So having an open stance and yes, being able to clarify the messaging, I think are both really important from an athlete perspective.
And I know from a youth perspective, when I coached my son in youth basketball, and again, there's more time there for that interaction, I think, in practice and in games. A lot of times what we tried to say when we saw a mistake is, what did you see on the court? Because standing on the sidelines as a coach, I see one thing, but you're like actually on the court. So what did you see sometimes can help filter that feedback. And so how do you think those conversations can go like during that feedback process?
That's a very empathetic response. You know, the concept of putting yourself into the shoes of somebody else is massive when it comes to feedback or having these types of conversations, because you're right, what the coach sees might not necessarily have been what the point guard saw or what the quarterback saw or what the goalie saw. And so having that conversation will allow you to get on the same page and get the perspective of the other person. And I think we all of us could benefit from taking a little bit more of deliberate getting in the shoes of somebody else these days.
Yeah, so we all know some of our athletes are just natural leaders. They're usually the captain of the team or the person that's rallying their teammates around them. What is the best way for them even to communicate with their teammates to correct an issue? And then can these athletes communicate different than a coach would in that peer-to-peer messaging?
Oh, they are at such an advantage in a lot of ways because they have often been voted on by their peers to be captains. So they have a peer leverage that they can take advantage of or utilize effectively. The hope is that they use that for good and they don't use that as like an ego power trip pedestal thing.
Right.
But I think, but what can also happen with some of these captains or senior leaders is they're the leaders because they're good at the sport, not necessarily because they're good leaders. Doesn't always happen that way, but it can. And so I think it's important for athletes to recognize if you're in this position, it is an important position. You may not realize it, but those sophomores that are on the team look up to you, right? Even if it sounds ridiculous, they like admire you. And so taking that position on with a lot of care and gravitas and importance, and not being flippant about it, and recognizing that you do have influence, your words do matter. And so a lot of the things that we were talking about from a coaching standpoint also applies to that of a senior leader or a junior leader or just a person that's a leader on a team, is to be more positive directed, try to understand the individuals, put empathy, put yourself in the shoes of another person. And those are very evolved soft skills. But just because they're evolved doesn't mean they're impossible. And so taking deliberate time to get those more right than you might have, not only will help serve the team in the moment, but will help serve you as a leader and a human being as you continue to grow older in this life.
And so we all know, just as in life, sometimes players struggle on a team for whatever reason. They don't quite understand that play. Sometimes they don't understand why XYZ is playing more than them. Like, a player perceives things differently in practice. So what is the best way for an athlete to communicate or ask the coach that question? And then should this be done privately as well?
Yes, I think it should be done privately. Again, I can't imagine. There may be situations where in a group setting, again, if it's something where you want to bring your teammate up and acknowledge and celebrate something that your teammate did that might have gone unnoticed, that's really cool to do in a group, but if you're trying to receive feedback or assess a situation of your own kind of playing time or growth, then that's probably better suited privately. And why privately? Well, one, there's not all these other eyes and ears that are taking the information in. That really is kind of no service to them. Two, it certainly reduces any extraneous distractions from being part of the conversation. And this is an important conversation, so I'm assuming we would want as little distractions as possible. And then thirdly, with a private conversation, it's just you and them, which then reduces the likelihood of misunderstanding and miscommunication because you only have to assess one another. In terms of having that conversation, it can feel awkward. Rightfully so. We don't typically have a lot of these types of conversations. And so by being able to get on the dance floor with at least some bullet points in your mind of this is what's going on with me, and I just want to check out or get some feedback on how you feel about this, coach, can be very helpful. But going into that blind can be challenging. No need to overthink it. No need to over anxious about it, because at the end of the day, the person, that coach that's sitting across from you, is just another human being who has likely been in the exact same situation you have to some degree at some point in their lives.
Okay. And before we transition to the parental side of things, is there anything else you'd like to add to the athletic side of things?
As an athlete, it's important to recognize that 99.9% of the time, coaches have your best interest in mind. They have the team's best interest in mind. They're not giving you feedback because they don't like you. They're not yelling at you because they don't like you. Yes, there can be some bad eggs in the world of coaching, but predominantly the majority of a lot of this is coming from a desire to get the most out of you and get the most out of the team. And so anytime you might get yelled at or maybe get some constructive criticism, keep that in mind and put it through a little internal Google Translate that, what's the way it's coming at me might not be ideal, but the message and meaning behind it is actually going to serve my growth and development.